Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights and let our minds drift back to a period in history that, for many, represents the absolute nadir of human existence, the life of a galley slave. You might have seen movies or read books that depict these unfortunate souls, but the reality was far grimmer than any fiction. Tonight, we'll delve into the awful life of a galley slave. You might imagine a heroic escape or a dramatic battle, but for your ancient ancestor trapped on a galley, life was a cycle of relentless misery, beginning with the terrifying moment their freedom vanished. You probably wouldn't have lasted a single week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in for tonight's journey, feel free to drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether that's a cozy evening in a quiet suburb of San Diego, California, or the early morning hours in a bustling Boston apartment. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself, now, a young fisherman named Elias from a small, sun-drenched village on the coast of Sicily, around 200 BCE. Your life is simple but free. You spend your days casting nets into the sparkling Mediterranean, feeling the sun on your skin, and listening to the rhythmic lapping of waves against your small fishing boat. You have a family, friends, and the quiet dignity of making your own way in the world. One clear morning, as the sun rises, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, you set out as usual. The sea is calm, promising a good catch. You're singing a simple tune, thinking of the warm bread and fresh olives awaiting you back home. Suddenly, the horizon darkens, not with a storm, but with the menacing silhouettes of three sleek, swift ships, their sails emblazoned with the dreaded Carthaginian insignia. Panic seizes your heart. These are not merchant vessels, they are warships, pirates, raiders. You try to flee, frantically pulling at your oars, but your small boat is no match for their speed. Within minutes, they are upon you. Rough hands grab you, pulling you from your boat. You struggle, cry out, but it's futile. A sharp blow to the head, and darkness engulfs you. When you awaken, disoriented and aching, you find yourself in the dimly lit, suffocating hold of a massive warship, your hands already bound. This is the harrowing moment of the fateful capture. Freedom's sudden end, the abrupt, terrifying instant your life of liberty is violently ripped away, casting you into an unimaginable nightmare from which there is no waking. It's like being kidnapped from your own backyard. But instead of a ransom note, you're given an oar. The path to becoming a galley slave was varied, but almost universally brutal. For many, like Elias, it began with capture. Pirates, ever-present scourges of ancient seas, would raid coastal villages, snatching unsuspecting inhabitants. Naval battles also supplied a steady stream of involuntary recruits. If your side lost a battle, and you were lucky enough to survive the initial carnage, you might find yourself spared from death only to be thrust into an even more agonizing fate. Prisoners of war, regardless of their previous status, were often deemed suitable for the oars. It was a cold, hard calculation. Human bodies were expendable, and the demand for rowers was constant. But capture wasn't the only route to this living hell. For others, it was the crushing weight of debt. In many ancient societies, if you couldn't pay your debts, you or members of your family could be sold into servitude. Imagine working tirelessly for years, only for a bad harvest or an unforeseen illness to plunge you into insurmountable debt, leading to the unthinkable being sold to a ship captain, your fate sealed by financial ruin. This was a particularly cruel twist of fate, as it stripped away not just your freedom but your very dignity, condemning you to a life of forced labor without ever having committed a crime. Then there were those condemned for crimes. Petty theft, insubordination, or even political dissent could lead to a sentence at the oars. Imagine a young man, perhaps a vagrant from the sprawling slums of ancient Rome, caught stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. his punishment. Not a short stint in a jail cell, but a lifetime chained to an oar, far from the bustling forum. His existence reduced to the monotonous rhythm of the waves. The severity of the punishment often far outweighed the nature of the crime, serving as a grim deterrent and a convenient way to fill the ranks of rowers. A common historical truth is that galley slaves in ancient times were primarily drawn from prisoners of war, captured civilians from coastal raids, and individuals condemned for various crimes or unable to pay their debts, indicating a broad and brutal system of involuntary servitude designed to meet the constant demand for manpower on naval vessels. The initial capture or condemnation marked an abrupt and devastating end to their former lives. Historians still widely debate the precise proportion of galley slaves from each category across different naval powers and historical periods. Given the limited and often biased nature of surviving records, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed detail about the fateful capture. Freedom's sudden end is the psychological warfare immediately deployed by captors or overseers, stripping away not just physical possessions, but any sense of individual identity or hope through deliberate humiliation, and the imposition of a new, dehumanizing role, often reinforced by a distinct, uncomfortable uniform or lack thereof, meant to instantly break the spirit before the physical torment even began. Imagine Elias, fresh from capture, being thrown into the dark hold. Before the chains are even fixed to his ankles, he's forced to strip, his clothes replaced by a coarse, rough loincloth, or nothing at all, in front of dozens of other terrified, bewildered individuals. His head might be roughly shaved or even branded with a symbol of ownership. His name might be ignored, replaced by a number or a derogatory term. This wasn't just about practicalities, it was a psychological assault, a deliberate attempt to erase his former self, his dignity, his hope, and replace it with the identity of a mere cog in the ship's engine. It's like losing your name and your face, and becoming just another piece of furniture in a very uncomfortable room. Once captured or condemned, the journey to the galley was often terrifying in itself. Packed into the holds of ships, sometimes hundreds of individuals crammed into airless, dark spaces, they faced days or weeks of uncertainty. Food would be scarce, water even scarcer. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and human waste. Disease would begin to fester even before they reached their final destination. A grim foreshadowing of the horrors to come. Many wouldn't even survive this initial transit, succumbing to thirst, starvation, or suffocation in the overcrowded holds. Upon arrival at a naval base or port city, the captured would be assessed. Their physical condition, their perceived strength, their age, all would be coldly evaluated to determine their suitability for the grueling work ahead. There was no compassion, no concern for their past lives, no questions about their families. They were simply bodies, units of labor, destined for the oars. For those who ended up on the great galleys of the Roman Empire, or the powerful triremes of ancient Greece, or even the formidable ships of the Ottoman Empire centuries later, the capture was a one-way ticket to a living death. Their previous lives, their hopes, their dreams, their very identities were brutally severed. The past became a hazy, painful memory, fading under the relentless sun and the ever-present threat of the whip. The concept of freedom itself became an abstract, almost mocking idea. They were not just imprisoned, they were enslaved to a floating machine of war or commerce. Their entire existence reduced to the monotonous, agonizing rhythm of pulling an oar. There was no escape, no appeal, no hope of rescue. The vastness of the sea, which once represented liberty and opportunity for a fisherman like Elias, now became the very boundary of their perpetual confinement. The horizon, once a symbol of endless possibilities, was now just a cruel reminder of how far they were from everything they had ever known, from every semblance of the life they had lost. So, while the idea of a ship gracefully gliding across ancient seas might evoke romantic images, the terrifying reality of the fateful capture, freedom's sudden end, was a brutal and common beginning for countless individuals. This era reminds us of the profound fragility of liberty and the utter ruthlessness of ancient systems of power, proving that for millennia, human lives were casually sacrificed to the demands of naval might, leaving us truly grateful for modern legal protections, human rights, and the international condemnation of slavery that define our world today. Far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of becoming a galley slave, let's gently return from the terrifying moment of the fateful capture. Freedom's sudden end, where countless lives were abruptly cast into the nightmare of involuntary servitude. If we've just explored how one became a galley slave, tonight we'll delve into the brutal physical realities of their existence chains and confinement. A living prison. You might imagine a brief period of restraint, but for your ancient ancestor shackled to an oar, their life was defined by the relentless reality of chains and confinement, transforming the entire ship into a perpetual, suffocating living prison. Imagine yourself now, our fisherman, Elias, from Sicily, or perhaps a condemned criminal named Marcus from the bustling docks of ancient Rome. Circa 100 CE, you've survived the initial capture and the brutal journey to a massive Roman quinquereme, a warship with 5 banks of oars. You are led down into the stifling gloom below deck. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and damp wood. Before you can even fully register your surroundings, rough, calloused hands force you down onto a narrow wooden bench, barely wide enough for your body. The heavy iron shackle is clamped around your ankle, or sometimes your wrist, and then secured to the bench or the oar itself. A clanking sound, a dull, metallic thud, reverberates in the oppressive quiet. This is it. This is your new reality. You try to move, to stretch, but the chain is agonizingly short, limiting your movement to a few painful inches. You look around, and in the dim light filtering from above, you see dozens, even hundreds, of other men, similarly bound, their faces etched with despair. This is the horrifying truth of chains and confinement, a constant physical restraint that transforms your very existence into a perpetual, suffocating living prison, where every breath and every movement is dictated by the unforgiving length of cold, hard iron. It's like being locked in a tiny, perpetually moving closet, but your limbs are literally bolted to the floor. The primary image that comes to mind when we think of galley slaves is that of perpetual chains, and for good reason. For much of the history of galleys, from ancient Greek triremes to Roman quinqueremes, and even the great ships of the medieval and early modern periods, rowers were indeed shackled. This wasn't merely a symbolic gesture, it was a practical necessity from the perspective of the ship's masters. The chains prevented escape, enforced discipline, and ensured that the rowers remained at their posts. Even in the chaos of battle or the fury of a storm, the most common form of restraint was an iron shackle around one ankle, usually the left, which was then permanently bolted or riveted to the rowing bench itself. Imagine wearing a heavy iron ring around your ankle, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months, even years. The constant friction would chafe and abrade the skin, leading to open sores, infections, and perpetual pain. Every movement, every shift on the hard bench, would be accompanied by the jingle and scrape of the metal. This was not just a chain, it was a constant, searing reminder of your utter lack of freedom, a physical manifestation of your enslavement. But it wasn't just the ankle. In some instances, particularly on Roman galleys during certain periods, rowers might also be chained at the wrist, especially if they were deemed rebellious or particularly valuable. Imagine having both an ankle and a wrist chained, further restricting your already minimal movement. Even eating, sleeping, or attending to basic bodily functions would become an agonizing contortion, a constant battle against the unyielding metal that bound you. It truly sucked to be a human being reduced to a piece of furniture by a length of iron. A common historical truth is that galley slaves across various ancient and later periods were commonly kept in perpetual physical restraint. often chained by the ankle to their rowing benches, a practice that ensured their confinement, prevented escape, and served as a constant instrument of psychological and physical control. This chaining was a hallmark of their brutal existence. Historians still widely debate the precise variations in chaining methods and the extent of individual mobility allowed on different types of galleys and during different eras. As detailed historical accounts are often fragmented or anecdotal, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed, detail about this brutal chains and confinement and how the ship became a literal living prison is the practice of hot riveting, where shackles were sometimes permanently attached by heating the iron and then hammering it closed around the prisoner's limb while it was still hot, making removal impossible without specialized tools and inflicting an initial, searing pain that physically branded the slave to their bench from day one, serving as a brutal, visceral reminder of their inescapable fate. Imagine Elias feeling the intense heat against his skin as the iron ring is sealed around his ankle, the smell of burning flesh, the searing pain that momentarily overwhelms all other sensations. This wasn't just about securing the chain, it was an act of deliberate, painful permanence, a ceremony of dehumanization that cemented his transition from free man to chained beast of burden. It's like getting a tattoo that's literally burned onto your flesh, just to remind you that you're never leaving. The sheer confinement of life on a galley was soul-crushing. Rowers were typically seated in rows, packed incredibly close together on narrow benches. They were rarely, if ever, allowed to leave their benches, even for basic necessities. The space between rowers was minimal, just enough for the synchronized movement of the oars. Imagine being unable to stand up straight, to walk more than a few steps, or even to fully stretch your limbs. Your muscles would atrophy from disuse. Except for those directly involved in rowing, your back would ache perpetually from the cramped, unnatural posture. Below deck, in the holds where many rowers were kept, the conditions were even more oppressive. Natural light was a luxury, replaced by the flickering glow of a few oil lamps or the dim shafts of light filtering down from open hatches. The air was heavy, humid, and stagnant, thick with the odors of unwashed bodies, human waste, and stale food. Ventilation was minimal, making every breath a struggle in the suffocating heat of the Mediterranean summer, or the freezing damp of winter. This constant confinement led to both physical and psychological degradation. The lack of movement caused muscle stiffness, joint pain, and circulatory issues. The perpetual darkness and lack of sensory stimulation could lead to a profound sense of despair, even a loss of touch with reality. You'd lose track of days, weeks, months, your world shrinking to the few feet around your bench. Your dreams, if you could still conjure them, would be filled with the vastness of the open sky and the feel of solid ground beneath your feet. A cruel contrast to your grim reality. Sleeping was an agonizing affair. You slept on the same hard wooden bench where you rowed, often chained to it. There was no space to lie down fully, no comfortable bedding. You slept in shifts, or simply whenever exhaustion overcame you, your body contorted, your muscles aching, the cold chain pressing into your skin. Imagine trying to find sleep amidst the constant creaking of the ship, the groans of your fellow slaves, and the never-ending discomfort of your chained body. It was a fitful, unrefreshing slumber that offered little respite. The galley itself became the entire world, a floating, self-contained, living prison. There was no outside, no escape, no horizon that promised freedom. The vastness of the sea, once a symbol of adventure, now became the ultimate barrier. Even if a chain broke, where would you go in the middle of the ocean? The only way off the ship was through death, or, in incredibly rare cases, through an act of mercy or an unlikely perilous revolt. So, while the idea of a powerful ancient warship might evoke images of strength and naval might, the terrifying reality of chains and confinement, transforming the entire vessel into a perpetual, suffocating living prison, was the daily truth for thousands of unfortunate souls. This era reminds us of the profound depths of human suffering under forced labor and the relentless dehumanization of the enslaved, proving that for millennia, the pursuit of military dominance often came at the cost of unimaginable personal torment, leaving us truly grateful for modern human rights, the abolition of slavery, and the understanding that no human being should ever be reduced to a mere instrument of labor. Far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's existence, let's gently return from the suffocating reality of chains and confinement, where the galley ship itself became a relentless living prison. If we've just explored the brutal physical and psychological torment of perpetual restraint, tonight we'll delve into the soul-crushing, body-breaking essence of a galley slave's existence. The oar's relentless rhythm, endless toil. You might imagine occasional breaks, but for your ancient ancestor, shackled to their bench, life was a continuous, mind-numbing cycle dictated by the oar's relentless rhythm. A seemingly endless toil fueled only by fear and desperation, and often the sting of the whip. Imagine yourself now. Our fisherman Elias from Sicily, or Marcus, the Roman criminal, or perhaps a captured Gaulish warrior named Brennus. Around 50 BCE, you are seated on your narrow bench, your ankle chafed raw by the iron shackle, a constant reminder of Chapter 2. The air below deck is thick with the groans of hundreds of men, the creak of timber, and the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierces the gloom from above, followed by the deep, resonant beat of a drum, marking the stroke. This is the coxswain, setting the pace. Your muscles, already aching from yesterday's efforts, brace instinctively. The whip cracks somewhere nearby, a chilling punctuation mark to the drumbeat. You grasp the massive, heavy oar, its rough wooden shaft worn smooth by countless hands. You lean back, pull with all your might, feeling the burn in your shoulders, back, and legs. Then, you release, lean forward, and prepare for the next stroke, and the next, and the next, for hours, for days, for weeks. This is the horrifying truth of the oar's relentless rhythm, a mind-numbing, body-breaking, endless toil that stripped away your individuality, transforming you into a mere extension of the ship. Your entire purpose reduced to a single, repetitive motion, driven by the ever-present threat of pain and exhaustion. It's like being forced to run a marathon every single day, while simultaneously lifting heavy weights, all while someone stands over you with a cattle prod. The galley slave's existence revolved entirely around the oar. It was the instrument of their torment, the source of their endless labor, and the very reason for their miserable existence. From dawn till dusk, and often through the night, their lives were consumed by the strenuous, monotonous act of rowing. This wasn't graceful, synchronized rowing for sport. It was brutal. Forced labor for survival. The oars themselves were colossal. On a large war galley like a trireme or quinquereme, oars could be upwards of 30 to 40 feet long, thick as a man's thigh, and incredibly heavy. While a single rower might handle a smaller oar on certain types of galleys, larger ships often featured multiple rowers per oar, sometimes 3, 5, or even more, each contributing their strength to the massive lever. Imagine having to coordinate your movements perfectly with several other exhausted, desperate men, all straining against the immense weight of a single oar, striving to maintain the oar's relentless rhythm. If one man faltered, the entire crew for that oar would be thrown off, potentially leading to tangled limbs and a swift, brutal correction from the overseers. A common historical truth is that galley slaves endured an extremely harsh and relentless routine of rowing, often for hours on end without significant breaks, operating massive oars that demanded immense physical exertion and precise synchronization with other rowers. This continuous, physically demanding labor was central to their daily lives and vital for the ship's propulsion. Historians still widely debate the precise number of rowers per oar on various ancient galley types, particularly the larger quinqueremes. as archaeological evidence and textual descriptions offer differing interpretations, making it difficult to definitively picture the exact layout and coordination of the rowing benches. A fascinating, yet rarely discussed detail about the oars' relentless rhythm and the sheer psychological burden of endless toil is the use of specialized rhythmic flutes or pipes played by a koliastes, a sort of rowing master, to set the stroke rate and maintain synchronization, transforming the act of rowing into a grim, percussive symphony of suffering, where the very music meant to coordinate their efforts served as a constant auditory reminder of their inescapable bondage and the never-ending nature of their work. Imagine Brennus, straining against the heavy oar, his muscles screaming, over the groans of his fellow slaves and the creak of the ship. He hears the mournful, repetitive melody of the koliastes flute. It's not a cheerful tune. It's a hypnotic, relentless rhythm that bores into his very soul, forcing him to move, to pull, to conform to the ship's demands. This wasn't just practical, it was a psychological tool, a subtle form of torture, turning an art form into an instrument of oppression. It's like a never-ending, agonizingly slow dance where you're forced to participate, with invisible strings pulling your every limb to the beat of a drummer who never stops. The duration of rowing was staggering. Unlike modern competitive rowing, which features relatively short, intense bursts, galley slaves were expected to row for hours on end, with only brief, infrequent breaks. In times of war or during long voyages, this endless toil could extend for days, with rowers operating in shifts or even being forced to row continuously until collapse. Imagine pulling an oar for 10, 12, 14 hours a day, your body screaming for rest, your hands raw and blistered, your mind numb with fatigue. The physical toll was immense. The constant, repetitive motion strained every major muscle group back: shoulders, arms, legs, and core. Chronic pain was a given. Swollen joints, torn muscles, severe blisters, and deep calluses were part of their daily reality. The posture required for rowing, often hunched over the oar, led to spinal deformities and persistent back pain. Imagine your spine curving unnaturally, your shoulders permanently slumped forward, even when you weren't rowing. A silent testament to years of forced labor. Beyond the muscular strain, the sheer exhaustion was debilitating. Sleep was rare and unrefreshing, stolen and brief. Uncomfortable naps on the hard benches. Still chained? The chronic lack of sleep, combined with malnutrition, something we'll explore in Chapter 4, would lead to profound fatigue, impaired cognitive function, and a heightened susceptibility to illness. Your mind would become foggy, your reflexes dulled, making every stroke an even greater effort. The mental aspect of this endless toil was perhaps even more insidious. The monotony of the rhythm, the unchanging view of the oar and the back of the man in front of you, the utter lack of purpose beyond brute labor, could chip away at a man's spirit. Dreams of freedom would fade, replaced by the grim reality of each passing stroke. Hope would become a dangerous luxury, quickly crushed by the sheer weight of their predicament. It truly sucked to have your spirit slowly extinguished by the relentless, monotonous grind. The overseers, or hortatores, were responsible for maintaining the pace and ensuring maximum effort. They stood or walked along a central gangway, armed with whips or canes. Any faltering in stroke, any sign of weakness or insubordination, was met with swift, brutal punishment. A terrifying reality we'll delve into in Chapter 6. The crack of the whip, the screams of a man being lashed, served as a constant, terrifying reminder to maintain the oar's relentless rhythm. Fear was the ultimate motivator, ensuring that even when bodies screamed in protest, the oars continued to move. So, while the idea of a powerful ancient warship might inspire awe, the terrifying reality of the oar's relentless rhythm, a mind-numbing, body-breaking, endless toil, was the agonizing truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound depths of human endurance under unimaginable duress and the ruthless efficiency of forced labor systems, proving that for millennia, the pursuit of naval power often came at the cost of utterly stripping human beings of their dignity and autonomy, reducing them to mere biological machines, leaving us truly grateful for modern labor laws, ergonomic design, and the fundamental recognition of human dignity in work that define our world today. Far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's daily grind, let's gently return from the agonizing reality of the oar's relentless rhythm, where endless toil stripped galley slaves of their bodies and spirits. If we've just explored the crushing physical demands of their labor, tonight we'll delve into another pervasive and insidious form of suffering: hunger and thirst, a battle for survival. You might imagine regular, if meager, rations, but for your ancient ancestor chained to an oar, their very existence was a constant, desperate battle for survival against the gnawing pangs of hunger and thirst, turning every meager meal and every precious sip of water into a fight for their very lives. Imagine yourself now, our Gaulish warrior, Brennus, or perhaps a captured Greek sailor named Aristos, from a small coastal town near Syracuse, around 100 BCE. The sun is blazing overhead, beating down on the deck of the Roman galley. You've been rowing for hours, your throat parched, your lips cracked, your muscles screaming for respite. The air is thick with the metallic tang of sweat, and the stale smell of the ship's hold, a familiar scent from our discussion of chains and confinement in Chapter 2. Your stomach growls with a deep, aching emptiness that has become your constant companion. Finally, the whistle blows, signaling a brief pause in the rowing. You watch with desperate eyes as a few weary crewmen move along the benches, ladling out a thin, watery gruel from a large pot, and offering a quick communal sip from a shared skin of stale water. You gulp down the meager portion, the rough grains scraping your parched throat, but it's barely enough to quell the deep-seated ache. You try to hoard a few drops of water in your mouth, savoring the wetness, knowing it might be hours, or even a full day, before you get another. This is the horrifying truth of hunger and thirst, a relentless existential battle for survival where every single calorie and every drop of liquid was a precious commodity, a testament to the chronic deprivation that defined the awful life of a galley slave. It's like living in a desert, but the oasis is controlled by someone who actively tries to keep you on the brink of collapse. Chronic hunger and thirst were fundamental components of the galley slave's existence, not merely occasional discomforts. The primary goal of the ship's masters was efficiency, extracting the maximum amount of labor from their human engines with the minimum expenditure of resources. This meant providing only enough food and water to keep the rowers alive and functioning, often barely so, turning every day into a literal battle for survival. The food provided to galley slaves was universally poor in quality and meager in quantity. Typically, their diet consisted of a coarse gruel made from barley or other cheap grains, perhaps with a bit of dried fruit or olives thrown in, if they were lucky. Meat was an extreme rarity, a luxury almost never afforded to them. Imagine a thick, unappetizing porridge served lukewarm, perhaps once or twice a day. This diet lacked essential nutrients, leading to widespread deficiencies that would manifest as weakness, fatigue, and increased susceptibility to disease. Your body would constantly crave more, signaling its profound deprivation with persistent stomach cramps and an aching emptiness. A common historical truth is that galley slaves consistently endured severe deprivation of food and water, receiving only meager and nutritionally poor rations designed merely to sustain their strenuous labor, which frequently led to chronic hunger, thirst, malnutrition, and a weakened state that made them vulnerable to illness. This deprivation was a deliberate and widespread practice across ancient navies. Historians still widely debate the exact caloric intake and nutritional composition of a typical galley slave's diet across different historical periods and naval powers. As precise records are scarce and often vary significantly, a fascinating Yet rarely discussed detail about this brutal hunger and thirst and the constant battle for survival is the subtle, often violent, microeconomy of desperation that emerged among the chained rowers, where small scraps of food, or even the most minute sips of water, it could be bartered, stolen, or fought over in hushed whispers and quick, brutal shoves, turning even these basic necessities into currency for small, fleeting advantages or temporary relief from the gnawing emptiness. Imagine Aristos, having just received his meager portion of gruel. He might eye a younger, weaker slave near him, assessing whether a quick, forceful nudge could make that slave drop a few precious grains onto the floor, which he could then frantically scoop up. Or perhaps a slave who managed to hide a single dried fig might trade it for a moment of quiet, undisturbed rest, or a whispered promise of protection. This wasn't about friendship or camaraderie, but it was about survival. And every resource, no matter how small, became a point of desperate contention. It's like finding a single, half-eaten crumb in a post-apocalyptic wasteland and knowing you'd fight a bear for it. Water was an even more critical and often scarcer commodity. Freshwater supplies on ancient ships were limited, stored in large amphorae or leather skins, and strictly rationed. Slaves would typically receive only a minimal amount, perhaps a single cup or two per day, which was barely enough to survive, let alone perform grueling physical labor under the hot sun. Imagine the agony of extreme thirst, your throat burning, your tongue feeling like sandpaper, the taste of salt in the air, the vast expanse of undrinkable ocean around you would be a constant, cruel reminder of your desperate need. Dehydration would be rampant, leading to dizziness, headaches, muscle cramps, and eventually organ failure. Many slaves would die simply from chronic dehydration. The psychological impact of perpetual hunger and thirst was profound. The mind becomes obsessed with food and water. Dreams would be filled with feasts, with gushing springs and cool, clear rivers. Every waking moment would be dominated by the gnawing ache in the stomach and the burning sensation in the throat. This constant deprivation would break down even the strongest will, reducing men to a primal state where survival superseded all other concerns. You wouldn't think of freedom or revenge. You'd think only of the next sip, the next bite, however meager. This chronic malnutrition and dehydration also had severe physical consequences beyond immediate discomfort. Bodies would waste away, muscles would atrophy, and energy levels would plummet. Scurvy, a debilitating disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, would be common, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, and extreme fatigue. Other vitamin deficiencies would cause night blindness, skin lesions, and impaired wound healing. Imagine a body that is perpetually run down, constantly fighting off ailments simply because it lacks the basic building blocks to sustain itself. The ship's masters understood the fine line they walked. They needed their rowers to be strong enough to pull the oars, but they didn't want to waste resources on feeding them well. It was a calculated form of control, keep them weak, keep them dependent, keep them just on the edge of starvation, and they would be less likely to rebel. The threat of withholding even these meager rations was a powerful deterrent, ensuring compliance and maximizing their endless toil, a grim callback to Chapter 3. It truly sucked when your very sustenance was wielded as a weapon against you. So, while the idea of a powerful ancient navy might suggest well-provisioned ships, the terrifying reality of hunger and thirst, a relentless existential battle for survival, was the daily truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound depths of human cruelty and the dehumanizing efficiency of forced labor systems, proving that for millennia, the pursuit of naval power often came at the cost of utterly stripping human beings of their basic physiological needs, reducing them to skeletal, parched shadows of their former selves, leaving us truly grateful for modern nutritional science, humanitarian aid, and the fundamental right to adequate sustenance that define our world today, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's perpetual starvation. Let's gently return from the relentless hunger and thirst, where a galley slave's life was a constant battle for survival against profound deprivation. If we've just explored the internal torment of starvation, tonight we'll delve into the external, often fatal, threats posed by their environment, disease, and decay. Sickness on the seas. You might imagine a few isolated cases of illness, but for your ancient ancestor in the fetid hold of a galley, their very existence was a constant struggle against disease and decay, turning every journey into a terrifying dance with sickness on the seas, where death was often more likely to come from an invisible microbe than an enemy's blade. Imagine yourself now, our Roman criminal, Marcus, or perhaps a captured Egyptian, enslaved from the Nile Delta, named Kemet, around 50 CE. You've been rowing for weeks on a vast trireme, the air below deck thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and stale vomit. A grim byproduct of our discussion on chains and confinement in Chapter 2. Your body, already weakened by chronic malnutrition and dehydration, the constant hunger and thirst of Chapter 4, aches perpetually. You hear the hacking coughs of the man next to you, a chilling rattle in his chest that's grown worse with each passing day. Another rower, further down the bench, lies still, his skin pale and clammy, a thin stream of pus seeping from the infected sores on his ankles where the shackle chafes raw. You try to avoid touching the communal food, but hygiene is non-existent. The floor beneath your bench is slick with grime and human waste. You feel a familiar tickle in your own throat, a subtle chill in your bones, and your stomach cramps with an ominous warning. This is the horrifying truth of disease and decay, the insidious, omnipresent threat of sickness on the seas, where the galley ship was not just a prison, but a floating incubator of epidemics, making every stroke of the oar a silent gamble with your very life. It's like living in a hospital ward where no one ever cleans, and everyone is already half-starved. The ancient galley was, by its very nature, a perfect breeding ground for disease and decay. The combination of extreme overcrowding, chronic malnutrition, lack of sanitation, and constant physical exertion created an environment where sickness flourished, spreading rapidly and often with devastating consequences. For the galley slave, illness was not a temporary inconvenience, it was a constant companion, a looming specter of death that often outpaced even the brutality of the whip or the perils of battle. Imagine hundreds of men packed into confined spaces below deck, with minimal ventilation. Personal hygiene was impossible. Slaves were rarely, if ever, allowed to wash themselves thoroughly. Their bodies, perpetually covered in sweat, dirt, and often their own waste, became havens for lice, fleas, and other parasites. These parasites, in turn, could transmit diseases, further exacerbating the already dire situation. The smell alone would be enough to make a modern person retch a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies. Stale air, and the pervasive odor of human excrement that permeated every nook and cranny of the ship. It truly sucked to live in such a perpetually putrid environment. A common historical truth is that galley slaves suffered terribly from widespread and fatal diseases due to extreme overcrowding, abysmal sanitation, malnutrition, and relentless physical exertion, transforming galleys into floating incubators for epidemics that decimated crews more effectively than enemy action. The lack of hygiene and basic medical care further ensured a high mortality rate from preventable illnesses. Historians still widely debate the precise mortality rates on ancient galleys and the specific diseases that were most prevalent. As surviving records often lack detailed medical observations or consistent statistical data, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed detail about this relentless spread of disease and decay and the profound impact of sickness on the seas is the unspoken pecking order that often emerged amongst the rowers regarding who received the most direct exposure to the noxious fumes and waste, with the lowest ranking or weakest slaves often relegated to the most putrid positions at the bilge. where accumulated filth and decomposing matter created a constant, toxic miasma that almost guaranteed respiratory infections and other lethal ailments. Imagine Kemet, our Egyptian slave. If he was new or particularly weak, being assigned to a bench closest to the bottom of the hull, near the bilge. This was where the ship's waste, stagnant water, and decaying food scraps would accumulate, creating a thick, poisonous vapor. Every breath would draw in microscopic pathogens and putrid odors, almost ensuring a quick descent into fever, coughing, and eventual collapse. This wasn't just poor sanitation. It was a tiered system of unavoidable, accelerated decay for those at the very bottom. It's like being forced to live in a sewer, but you're also expected to run a marathon every day. The lack of sanitation was perhaps the single greatest contributor to widespread illness. Slaves were chained to their benches, making it impossible to use proper latrines. Buckets might be passed down the rows, or more often, rowers would simply relieve themselves where they sat, the waste falling into the bilge below. This created a perpetually filthy environment, teeming with bacteria and viruses. Disease vectors, like flies and rats, would thrive in these conditions, further spreading pathogens. Every surface, every breath, every interaction carried the risk of infection. Water supplies already meager. Remember the constant thirst from Chapter 4, were often contaminated, stored in large casks for long periods, or collected from questionable sources. The water could harbor bacteria, leading to dysentery, cholera, and other gastrointestinal diseases. Imagine the agony of continuous, severe diarrhea while chained to a bench. Unable to move, unable to clean yourself, the weakness rapidly draining your already limited strength. Dehydration from these illnesses would quickly lead to death in an environment already lacking sufficient water. Common ailments included dysentery, typhus spread by lice, which were rampant, scurvy due to chronic lack of vitamin C from their poor diet, as we also discussed in Chapter 4, and various respiratory infections like pneumonia, exacerbated by the damp, cold, and stagnant air below deck. Wounds, whether from the lash at chilling thought for Chapter 6 or from the constant chafing of chains, would easily become infected, often leading to gangrene and limb loss if the individual even survived. A simple cut, a minor scratch, could become a death sentence in this environment. Medical care was virtually non-existent for galley slaves. Ship surgeons, if present, were primarily concerned with the officers and free crew. A slave's life was considered expendable. If a slave fell ill, they were often left to die, or in some cases, simply thrown overboard to prevent the spread of disease to the more valuable crew members. There was no compassion, no treatment, no hope of recovery once serious illness set in. You would simply waste away, your body consumed by fever, your breath growing shallower with each passing hour, until the final, merciful darkness. The psychological toll of constant exposure to sickness and death was immense. Seeing your fellow rowers sicken and die around you, hearing their groans and death rattles, knowing that you were likely next, created a profound sense of despair and hopelessness. Every cough, every ache, every sign of weakness would be met with a cold dread, a silent countdown to your own inevitable demise. It truly sucked to live in a perpetual death ward. So, while the idea of ancient naval power might evoke images of triumphant fleets, the horrifying reality of disease and decay, turning every journey into a terrifying dance with sickness on the seas, was the daily truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound vulnerability of human life in unhygienic conditions, and the brutal indifference of ancient systems to the suffering of the enslaved, proving that, for millennia, the pursuit of maritime dominance came at the cost of countless lives lost not to battle, but to the invisible, insidious enemy of disease, leaving us truly grateful for modern medicine, sanitation, and the fundamental right to health and dignity that define our world today. Far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's perpetual struggle against illness, let's gently return from the pervasive threat of disease and decay. where sickness on the seas claimed countless lives on ancient galleys. If we've just explored the internal and environmental dangers, tonight we'll delve into the external, immediate, and utterly brutal means of control, the lash and the whip. Pain as persuasion. You might imagine stern words or confinement, but for your ancient ancestor shackled to an oar, their very existence was governed by the lash and the whip, where raw, searing pain was persuasion, a constant, terrifying symphony of crack and scream, designed to extract every last ounce of effort and obedience. Imagine yourself now, our Roman criminal, Marcus, or perhaps a young, defiant Germanic prisoner of war named Hagen, around 70 CE. You've endured weeks, perhaps months, of the incessant oar's relentless rhythm, a mind-numbing reality from Chapter 3. Your body weakened by hunger and thirst, that constant battle for survival we discussed in Chapter 4, and the gnawing fear of sickness on the seas, the pervasive threat from Chapter 5. You are exhausted, your muscles screaming, your movements slowing imperceptibly. From the gangway above, the Hortotter, the rowing master, a hulking figure with a cruel glint in his eye, notices your flagging effort. His eyes lock onto yours. He doesn't need to speak. You see the leather whip coiled in his hand, its long, heavy thongs glistening with sweat. He raises it, the air whistling ominously. Then, the crack. A sharp, explosive sound that rips through the oppressive quiet of the hold. The searing pain blooms across your back, a fiery serpent twisting around your ribs, leaving a burning welt that erupts into agonizing agony. You cry out, an involuntary gasp of pain, and instantly, instinctively, you pull harder on the oar. This is the horrifying truth of the lash and the whip, the constant, brutal reality where raw, unadulterated pain was persuasion, the primary language spoken between master and slave, ensuring compliance and crushing defiance with every agonizing stroke. It's like being forced to run on a treadmill, but if you slow down, someone literally whips you, then smiles as you speed up. Corporal punishment was not merely a disciplinary tool on ancient galleys, it was the foundational principle of their operation. The lash and the whip were ubiquitous, wielded by overseers, the hortators, to maintain the relentless pace of rowing, enforce strict obedience, and break the spirit of any slave who dared to falter or rebel. It was a system built on fear, where the constant threat of agony ensured compliance. The whips themselves varied but were uniformly brutal. They could be simple leather thongs, sometimes braided or studded with metal for added impact. Other versions might include a stick with multiple leather strips attached, or even a cat-o'-nine-tails style whip, designed to inflict maximum pain and tear flesh with each stroke. Imagine the sheer terror of seeing such an instrument raised above you, knowing what was coming. It truly sucked to be under the constant threat of such instruments of torture. A common historical truth is that galley slaves were routinely subjected to severe corporal punishment, primarily flogging with whips or lashes, by their overseers to enforce grueling rowing speeds, maintain discipline, and suppress any form of resistance. This brutal system of physical pain was a fundamental and widely accepted method of control on ancient galleys. Historians still widely debate the precise psychological effects of constant fear and physical abuse on the long-term mental health and life expectancy of galley slaves. Given the limited personal accounts and the inherent difficulty of measuring such trauma retrospectively, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed, detail about this brutal reality of the lash and the whip, and how pain was persuasion, is the calculated performance of the flogging, where hortators might vary the intensity and rhythm of the blows, not just to inflict pain, but to create a terrifying, almost theatrical demonstration of absolute power for the benefit of the entire rowing crew, using the screams of the victim as a chilling lesson and a reminder of their own precarious existence. Imagine Hagen, as he is lashed, his screams echoing in the oppressive hold. The hortator isn't just delivering random blows, he might pause between strokes, letting the silence magnify the anticipation, or strike with a deliberate rhythm, making the punishment a grim, percussive warning to every other slave within earshot. This wasn't just about correcting an individual, it was a public spectacle. A chilling ballet of brutality designed to ensure that fear permeated every single rower, reinforcing that resistance was futile and suffering was inevitable. It's like attending a very unpleasant, painful concert where the main act is someone getting tortured, and you're the next performer on the list. The reasons for flogging were numerous and often arbitrary. Slowing down, falling out of sync with the other rowers, showing signs of exhaustion, speaking out of turn, or any perceived act of defiance could lead to the whip. Even a simple exhausted slump could be interpreted as insubordination and met with brutal swiftness. The message was clear. Your body was not your own. Every muscle, every ounce of energy belonged to the ship. The pain inflicted by these floggings was excruciating. The blows would tear skin, raise bloody welts, and, with repeated strikes, could strip flesh from bone. The wounds would become infected in the unsanitary conditions, a chilling reminder of disease and decay from Chapter 5, leading to fever, sepsis, and often, death. Many slaves carried the permanent scars of countless floggings on their backs, a grim map of their suffering. These weren't just temporary punishments, they were physical brandings, marking them as perpetually abused. The psychological impact of constant, pervasive fear was devastating. Living under the perpetual shadow of the whip would break even the strongest wills. It cultivated a sense of absolute powerlessness, teaching slaves that their only recourse was obedience. No matter how agonizing the task, the fear of pain would override instinct, push tired bodies beyond their limits, and silence any whisper of rebellion. You learn to anticipate the crack, to flinch, and to redouble your efforts before the blow even landed. Sometimes, the purpose of the flogging wasn't just punishment, but a desperate attempt to extract more effort from an already exhausted man. As a galley approached its destination, or during a heated naval battle, the hortatores would push the rowers to their absolute breaking point, using the whip to maintain peak performance, even as bodies collapsed around them. It was a race against time and exhaustion, with the lash serving as a constant, brutal motivator. Imagine rowing with a burst of desperate energy, knowing that the only thing keeping you moving is the burning pain across your back, or the fear of a fresh set of agonizing welts. This brutal discipline extended beyond the physical. The public nature of the floggings, often carried out in full view and earshot of the other slaves, was a deliberate act of psychological terror. Witnessing a fellow slave scream in agony, watching their back turn bloody and raw, served as a chilling reminder of one's own precarious position and the absolute power of the overseers. It fostered a desperate individualism, where each slave was so consumed by their own survival and the avoidance of the lash that collective action became almost impossible. So, while the idea of a disciplined ancient naval crew might suggest efficient operations, the horrifying reality of the lash and the whip, where raw, searing pain was persuasion, was the daily truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound depths of human cruelty and the dehumanizing efficiency of control through brute force, proving that for millennia, the pursuit of naval power came at the cost of unimaginable personal agony and the systematic crushing of the human spirit, leaving us truly grateful for modern human rights, the abolition of corporal punishment, and the understanding that true efficiency stems from dignity and respect, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's perpetual torment. Let's gently return from the agonizing reality of the lash and the whip, where pain was persuasion, a constant, brutal method of control on ancient galleys. If we've just explored the direct infliction of suffering, tonight we'll delve into the pervasive, unescapable filth that compounded every other torment, squalor, and filth. A world of waste. You might imagine a few dirty corners, but for your ancient ancestor chained to an oar, their entire existence was a living nightmare of squalor and filth. A perpetually putrid world of waste that stripped away every last shred of dignity and fostered rampant disease. Imagine yourself now, Our young Germanic warrior, Hagen, or perhaps a captured Greek intellectual named Lysander, around 100 CE. You've been on this Roman galley for months, your body ravaged by hunger and thirst, that constant battle for survival from Chapter 4, and the ever-present threat of sickness on the seas. The invisible enemy from Chapter 5 looms over every breath. You are still feeling the burning ache of the lash across your back, the lingering mark of the lash and the whip from Chapter 6, a fresh reminder of the Hortator's brutal authority. You try to shift on your narrow bench, but it's slick with layers of grime, old sweat, and human waste. The air is so thick with the stench that you can almost taste it, a putrid cocktail of stale urine, feces, unwashed bodies, and rotting food scraps. Beneath your feet, the bilge water sloshes, a dark, murky soup filled with unimaginable horrors. Sometimes rats scurrying through it. You see discarded crusts of moldy bread, flies buzzing lazily over festering sores on a neighboring rower's leg, and the constant drip of sweat and condensation from the low ceiling. This is the horrifying truth of squalor and filth, a suffocating, perpetually putrid world of waste where every surface, every breath, every moment was a testament to extreme neglect and dehumanization, making life a truly repugnant experience. It's like being trapped in a moving garbage dump, and you're forced to live in the deepest, dirtiest part of it, the conditions on ancient galleys, particularly in the rowing decks where slaves were confined. Defy modern imagination. They were characterized by extreme squalor and filth, turning the ship into a floating cesspool. This wasn't merely an unfortunate consequence. It was an inherent aspect of a system that viewed its human propulsion units as utterly disposable. With no regard for their basic hygiene or dignity, the primary source of this pervasive filth was the complete lack of sanitation facilities. As we touched on in Chapter 5, slaves were chained to their benches, a constant reality from Chapter 2, making it impossible for them to move freely, let alone use proper latrines. This meant that rowers were often forced to relieve themselves where they sat, or into crude buckets that were rarely emptied. The waste would then accumulate on the benches, on the floor, and, eventually, in the bilge, the lowest part of the ship. Imagine sitting in your own waste, day after day, week after week. Your clothes, if you even had any beyond a loincloth, would be perpetually soiled, your skin chafed and irritated by constant contact with grime. It truly sucked to live in such a disgusting, inescapable mess. A common historical truth is that galley slaves lived in abominable conditions of extreme squalor and filth, with pervasive human waste, rotting food, and vermin, due to the complete lack of sanitation facilities and the perpetual confinement of rowers to their benches. This environment directly contributed to widespread disease and profound dehumanization. Historians still widely debate the exact protocols for waste disposal on various types of ancient galleys, and how frequently bilges were emptied or cleaned. As surviving ship manifests or operational manuals rarely detail such grim practicalities, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed, detail about this profound squalor and filth, and the overwhelming reality of a world of waste is the deliberate encouragement of extreme social alienation among rowers, partly by design of their living conditions, where the pervasive stench and physical repugnance of their neighbors made even casual human contact a repellent experience, thus hindering any collective action or rebellion by fostering intense individual disgust and isolation. Imagine Lysander, the intellectual, normally accustomed to cleanliness and order. Now he's surrounded by hundreds of men, each emitting their own particular stench of unwashed body, sweat, and waste. The person next to him might have open, festering sores that seep pus, or an unaddressed bowel movement staining their bench. This wasn't just unpleasant, it created a psychological barrier, making physical closeness inherently repulsive. It subtly reinforced the idea that each individual was truly alone in their misery, too disgusted by their neighbors to consider cooperation, let alone rebellion. It's like being stuck on a perpetually crowded subway, But everyone is constantly vomiting and nobody can move. Beyond human waste, the general upkeep of the ship was minimal, especially in the slave quarters. Rotting food scraps, discarded clothing, and stagnant water would accumulate. Vermin thrived in these conditions. Rats and mice would scurry through the rows, gnawing on whatever they could find, and contributing to the spread of disease, a terrifying connection to Chapter 5. Lice and fleas would infest the slaves' bodies, causing incessant itching and further transmitting pathogens. Imagine the constant irritation of thousands of tiny bites, adding another layer of torment to your already miserable existence. The air quality was horrific. Below deck, with minimal ventilation, the atmosphere was heavy with noxious fumes, the ammonia from urine, the methane from decaying waste, the pervasive odor of unwashed bodies. This foul air would be difficult to breathe, causing respiratory problems, coughing, and nausea. In the heat of the Mediterranean summer, the stench would be almost unbearable, turning every breath into a conscious act of endurance. You'd feel the weight of the putrid air pressing down on your lungs, making it hard to get enough oxygen even when not rowing. The physical effects of this squalor and filth were devastating. Open sores, exacerbated by the constant chafing of chains of familiar torment from Chapter 2 and contact with waste, would rarely heal and quickly become infected. Skin diseases, fungal infections, and rashes would be rampant. The lack of clean water for washing meant that even if a wound wasn't from the lash, it would inevitably become a festering source of agony. Your body would be a canvas of unhealed wounds, grime, and parasitic infestations. This constant exposure to a world of waste also contributed significantly to the spread of epidemics, a primary cause of fatalities from Chapter 3. Diseases like dysentery, typhus, and cholera would rip through the cramped, unsanitary rowing decks, quickly claiming lives. The filth acted as a direct conduit for pathogens, turning every ship into a floating incubator of death. When a new disease swept through, the rowers were the first and hardest hit. Their weakened bodies offering little resistance, the psychological impact of living in such pervasive filth was profound. It stripped away every last shred of human dignity. To be reduced to living in your own waste, to be constantly surrounded by the putrescence of hundreds of other suffering individuals, was to be utterly dehumanized. It instilled a sense of worthlessness, a feeling that your life was truly less than that of an animal. This constant physical degradation compounded the mental despair, making the prospect of death sometimes seem like a welcome release. So, while the idea of a mighty ancient fleet might evoke images of pristine vessels, the horrifying reality of squalor and filth, turning the entire ship into a perpetually putrid world of waste, was the daily truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound depths of human neglect and the brutal efficiency of dehumanization, proving that for millennia, the pursuit of naval power came at the cost of unimaginable living conditions, transforming human beings into mere components of a machine, living and dying in their own refuse, leaving us truly grateful for modern sanitation, public health, and the fundamental right to humane living conditions that define our world today, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's repulsive existence. Let's gently return from the suffocating reality of squalor and filth, where a galley slave's existence was a perpetually putrid world of waste. If we've just explored the dehumanizing impact of their environment, tonight we'll delve into the most terrifying and immediate threat to their lives: battle's brutality, a front row seat to death. You might imagine a quick end, but for your ancient ancestor chained to an oar during naval combat, every clash of ships meant experiencing battle's brutality, being thrust into a front row seat to death, where survival was often a matter of agonizing chance amidst chaos, fire, and the screams of dying men. Imagine yourself now, our former Greek intellectual, Lysander, or perhaps a young, terrified, captured Briton named Cale, around 180 CE, serving on a Roman trireme. You've endured the relentless oars rhythm, the endless toil of Chapter 3, the gnawing hunger and thirst, the constant battle for survival from Chapter 4, and the pervasive sickness on the seas, the invisible enemy from Chapter 5. You are weary, scarred by the lash and the whip pain as persuasion from Chapter 6, and constantly surrounded by the squalor and filth of your existence, your world of waste from Chapter 7. Suddenly, the ship's bell clangs violently, a frantic, piercing sound that cuts through the monotonous creak of the timbers. A shout echoes from above deck, enemy sighted. You feel the ship lurch as it changes course, the rhythm of the oars intensifying, a desperate final burst of speed. Then, a crashing sound, like thunder, as the ship rams into an enemy vessel. Splintering wood, the screams of men, the terrifying clang of steel on steel, all erupt around you. Fire erupts on the deck above, sending smoke and burning debris raining down into the hold. You hear the desperate shouts of your own ship's marines, the cries of the enemy, and the horrifying gurgle of men drowning. You are chained to your bench, a grim reminder of chains and confinement from Chapter 2. Unable to move. Unable to defend yourself. A trapped spectator in a maelstrom of death. This is the horrifying truth of battle's brutality, being plunged into a front row seat to death, where your life, utterly beyond your control, hung by a thread in the violent, chaotic heart of naval warfare. It's like being forced to sit in the front row of a gruesome, bloody movie, but the special effects are real, and the next explosion might be directly in your face. For the Galley Slave, a naval battle was the ultimate terror. Unlike the free Marines or sailors on deck who could fight or maneuver, the rowers were largely helpless, utterly at the mercy of fate, the ship's movements, and the progress of the conflict above them. Their lives, already precarious, became horrifyingly expendable in the maelstrom of combat. The initial shock of a battle beginning would be profound. The sudden change in the ship's movement, the frantic shouts of officers, the shift from rhythmic rowing to desperate, often irregular bursts of speed would signal the impending doom. Then, the sickening crunch of impact as the ram hit an enemy ship, or the jarring blow of grappling hooks as two vessels latched together. For the men below deck, this was a sensory overload of terror, the roar of the crowd if near shore. A macabre thought hearkening to Spectacle's appetite from Chapter 8 of our Olympic series. The clang of weapons, the screams of the wounded and dying, all amplified by the enclosed space of the hold. A common historical truth is that galley slaves faced exceptionally high mortality rates during naval battles, not primarily from direct combat, but from being trapped below deck in sinking, burning, or ramming vessels, making their survival a matter of sheer chance. They were essentially human ballast and propulsion, with little agency or protection during engagements. Historians still widely debate the precise tactics used by various ancient navies regarding their galley slaves during battle, including whether they were ever released to fight or if their chains were momentarily loosened. As accounts are often contradictory or anecdotal, a fascinating, yet rarely discussed, detail about battle's brutality and the horrifying reality of a front row seat to death is the strategic deployment of scorching tactics by enemy ships, where incendiary projectiles or flaming arrows were deliberately aimed at the open rowing ports of an opposing galley, sending burning pitch, flaming oil, or even superheated water cascading directly onto the chained rowers below, transforming the ship into a burning inferno and ensuring a terrifying, agonizing death by fire or scalding for those trapped within. Imagine Cale, rowing with desperate speed, when suddenly a torrent of flaming pitch arcs through the rowing port directly above him, splashing onto the bench and igniting the very wood he sits on. The screams of the men around him, trapped in their chains, are unbearable as the flames lick at their skin. The smoke chokes their lungs. This wasn't accidental fire. It was a deliberate, horrific method of eliminating the enemy's propulsion, turning the rowers into a weapon against their own ship by setting them ablaze. It's like being trapped in a burning building, but you're literally bolted to the floor, and the arsonist is actively pouring gasoline through your window. The immediate dangers for rowers were numerous. If their ship was rammed, the impact could shatter the hull, sending splinters flying, or even outright crush the rowers in the impact zone. Imagine a massive wooden beam, driven by the force of another ship, splintering through the hull directly where you are chained, impaling you instantly, or crushing you between two planks. Fires were another terrifying threat. Naval battles often involved the use of incendiary weapons, flaming arrows, Greek fire, or burning pitch. If the deck caught fire, the flames would quickly spread, often dropping burning debris into the open rowing holds. Trapped in their chains, a literal anchor from Chapter 2, rowers would have little to no chance of escape. They would either burn alive, slowly suffocating from the smoke, or, if the fire breached the hull, drown as the ship filled with water. The screams of hundreds of men burning alive or drowning in the dark. Confined space would be a horrifying sound, far more terrifying than the clash of swords above. Drowning was perhaps the most common fate. If the ship was holed, either by ramming or by enemy projectiles, it would rapidly begin to sink. For the chained rowers, this was a slow, agonizing death. As the water rose, they would be forced to watch it creep up their legs, then their chests, until it finally engulfed them. Their very chains, designed to keep them working, would become instruments of their demise, pulling them down to a watery grave. Imagine the utter despair as the cold water rises around you, knowing that there is absolutely nothing you can do, and your last breath is a mouthful of salty sea. Even if the ship didn't sink or burn, the chaos of battle above deck could spill into the rowing holds. Loose rigging, falling masts, or even bodies of fallen Marines could plummet through openings, crushing the rowers below. Enemy soldiers, if they successfully boarded the ship, might sweep through the rowing decks, mercilessly slaughtering the slaves to prevent any potential resistance or simply out of brutal efficiency. It truly sucked to be a passive target in a war zone. The psychological toll of a front row seat to death was immense. To be utterly powerless. To know that your fate rested entirely on the skill and luck of others. To be unable to fight, flee, or even hide would be soul-shattering. Every clang, every explosion, every scream would be amplified by your helplessness. You would hear the death throes of your comrades, feel the vibrations of the ship being torn apart, and smell the acrid stench of smoke and blood, all while straining against your chains, awaiting your own inevitable, agonizing end. So, while the idea of a glorious ancient naval battle might evoke images of tactical brilliance and heroic Marines, the horrifying reality of battle's brutality, plunging galley slaves into a front row seat to death, was the terrifying truth for countless unfortunates. This era reminds us of the profound expendability of human life in ancient warfare and the brutal logic of military power, proving that for millennia, naval dominance was achieved at the cost of unimaginable suffering for those literally powering the ships. Leaving us truly grateful for modern ethical warfare, the protection of non-combatants, and the fundamental right to defend oneself that define our world today, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's battle experience. Let's gently return from the terrifying reality of battle's brutality, where galley slaves endured a front row seat to death amidst naval combat. If we've just explored the external, sudden threats, tonight we'll delve into the internal, persistent torment of their desperate hope escape's futility. Dreams against the odds. You might imagine daring breakouts, but for your ancient ancestor chained to an oar, any thought of escape was quickly confronted by escape's futility, turning their most fervent hopes into mere dreams against the odds. A cruel, fleeting illusion in an otherwise endless nightmare. Imagine yourself now, our former Greek intellectual, Lysander, or perhaps a captured North African named Zaid, around 200 CE, serving on a large Roman cargo galley, though still chained to your bench. The ship is relatively calm, cruising through the open Mediterranean under a starlit sky. The oars' relentless rhythm, the constant toil from Chapter 3 has momentarily ceased, allowing a brief, restless period of sleep. Your body is aching from hunger and thirst, the battle for survival from Chapter 4 and marked by the lash and the whip pain, as persuasion from Chapter 6. You hear the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull, a sound that, for a fleeting moment, almost whispers of freedom. In your semi-conscious state, your mind conjures images of a distant coastline, a hidden cove, the feeling of solid ground beneath your feet, the warmth of a fire in a small, remote village. You even picture yourself somehow breaking your chains, those constant reminders of chains and confinement, from Chapter 2 and swimming to shore. But then, a cold splash of water from a creaking seam above brings you back to the suffocating reality of the hold, the omnipresent stench of squalor and filth. Your world of waste from Chapter 7. You look down at the heavy iron shackle around your ankle, the rusted rivet holding it fast. You peer through the tiny, barred rowing port, seeing nothing but the vast, indifferent ocean. The dream shatters, replaced by the crushing weight of your inescapable prison. This is the brutal truth of escape's futility, where every flicker of hope was quickly extinguished by the overwhelming reality of being truly alone. Adrift on an endless sea, turning even your most desperate aspirations into nothing more than fleeting dreams against the odds. It's like being trapped in a meticulously designed, maximum security prison. But the walls are made of endless ocean, and your cell floats within it. For a galley slave. The thought of escape, however remote, must have been a constant, tormenting presence. Yet the reality of their situation rendered almost every attempt at freedom utterly futile. The very design of the galley, combined with the vastness of the open sea, created an almost perfect prison. The most immediate and obvious barrier was the chains. As we explored in Chapter 2, rowers were typically shackled to their benches, often with permanent rivets. Breaking these heavy iron chains required specialized tools, immense strength, and, crucially, time, none of which a slave possessed. Imagine trying to chip away at thick iron with your bare hands, or with a tiny, smuggled piece of rock, all while under constant surveillance. It was a physical impossibility, a cruel joke played by their captors. A common historical truth is that successful escapes by galley slaves were exceedingly rare due to the insurmountable obstacles presented by their perpetual chaining. The vastness of the open sea, the constant surveillance by armed guards, and the lack of resources or knowledge required for survival outside the ship. The inherent design of the galley and its operational environment made escape nearly impossible. Historians still widely debate the specific number of documented slave revolts or successful escapes versus the sheer number of enslaved individuals, often concluding that most anecdotal tales of escape are likely exaggerated or semi-mythical, underscoring the overwhelming odds against freedom. A fascinating, yet rarely discussed detail about escape's futility and the crushing weight of dreams against the odds is the psychological tactic employed by overseers of occasionally leaving a small, seemingly accessible tool like a loose nail or a discarded piece of metal within view, knowing it would spark a flicker of false hope in a slave, only to then observe and punish any attempt to use it, deliberately crushing their spirit by demonstrating the impossibility of even the slightest act of self-liberation, thus reinforcing absolute control. Imagine Zaid noticing a small, dull piece of metal glinting tantalizingly close to his bench. Perhaps left accidentally by a careless guard? His heart might pound with a forbidden excitement. He might spend days, weeks, subtly trying to reach it, to test its sharpness against his chain, only to be suddenly, brutally whipped by the Hordador, a chilling reminder of the lash and the whip from Chapter 6. Who had been watching his every move, his cruel smile confirming the trap. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about destroying the very essence of hope, turning the desire for freedom into a source of immediate, agonizing pain. It's like dangling a key in front of a starving dog, only to snatch it away just as it reaches for it, even if, by some miraculous stroke of luck, a slave managed to break their chains. The challenges didn't end there. The ship was heavily guarded. Armed marines and overseers patrolled the decks and gangways, ever vigilant. Any unauthorized movement, any attempt to reach the upper deck, would be met with immediate and lethal force. Imagine trying to sneak past heavily armed guards in a cramped, noisy environment with hundreds of other slaves watching your every move. It was a suicide mission. Then there was the sea itself. If a slave somehow made it off the ship, they would be in the middle of a vast, indifferent ocean. Very few slaves would know how to swim effectively, having likely never had the opportunity. Even if they could swim, how far could they go? Land might be hundreds of miles away, or they might be in open water with no land in sight. The constant hunger and thirst. Chapter 4 would quickly return, amplified by the exertion of swimming. The risk of hypothermia, exposure, or attack by marine life would be immense. The sea, which for a free man represented passage and commerce, became the ultimate inescapable barrier to freedom. Furthermore, and even if a slave reached a coastline, they would likely be in hostile territory. Without food, water, or knowledge of the local language or customs, they would be easily identifiable by their emaciated bodies, their scars from floggings, and their often shaved heads. They would be pursued relentlessly, as escaped slaves represented a significant financial loss to their owners. Capture would mean an even worse fate, perhaps crucifixion or a return to the oars with increased punishment. It truly sucked when freedom itself was a mirage, leading only to a more agonizing doom. The psychological toll of this escape's futility was immense. To live with the constant, tantalizing dream of freedom, only to have it repeatedly crushed by the grim reality of their chains. The guards and the endless ocean would be soul-destroying. Hope, in such a context, could be a dangerous emotion, leading only to greater despair. Many slaves likely learned to suppress any thoughts of escape, focusing solely on the immediate task of survival, of enduring the oar's relentless rhythm until death provided the only true release. So, while the idea of a daring escape from the confines of an ancient galley might fuel dramatic narratives, the brutal reality of escape's futility, turning every glimmer of hope into mere dreams against the odds, was the agonizing truth for countless galley slaves. This era reminds us of the profound powerlessness of individuals trapped within merciless systems and the overwhelming obstacles faced by those yearning for freedom, proving that, for millennia, human ingenuity in crafting prisons, both physical and psychological, often far outstripped the desperate courage of those seeking liberty, leaving us truly grateful for modern human rights, international protections for refugees, and the fundamental belief in the right to freedom that define our world today, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's impossible quest for liberty. Let's gently return from the crushing reality of escape's futility, where a galley slave's life was defined by dreams against the odds of ever regaining freedom. If we've just explored the almost insurmountable barriers to their liberty, tonight we'll conclude our journey by examining the rare, often bittersweet, moments of actual release and the lasting impact such an awful life had on those few who survived freedom's fragility. The lingering scars. You might imagine immediate, joyous liberation, but for your ancient ancestor who somehow escaped the oar, freedom's fragility meant navigating a world utterly changed, carrying indelible, lingering scars, both physical and psychological, from a life in chains. Imagine yourself now, a man named Silas, once a proud Roman legionary, captured in battle years ago and condemned to the oars. You've endured the relentless oar's rhythm, the endless toil of Chapter 3, battled hunger and thirst, that constant struggle from Chapter 4, survived bouts of sickness on the seas, the pervasive threat from Chapter 5, and carried the permanent marks of the lash and the whip pain as persuasion from Chapter 6 on your back. You've lived amidst the pervasive squalor and filth, your world of waste from Chapter 7, and somehow, miraculously, survived battle's brutality, a front-row seat to death from Chapter 8 on multiple occasions. Your dreams of escape have been crushed countless times by escape's futility, those dreams against the odds from Chapter 9. But then, one day, it happens. Perhaps your ship is captured by a rival navy, and you are deemed a valuable Roman enough to be exchanged. Or perhaps a new emperor declares an amnesty for certain prisoners. Suddenly, The chains around your ankle, a constant, painful reminder of chains and confinement from Chapter 2, are finally struck off. The heavy iron shackle falls to the deck with a dull thud. You try to stand, but your legs, atrophied from years of sitting, tremble uncontrollably, threatening to give way. The sun, which you've only seen in blinding flashes through the rowing ports, now seems impossibly bright, hurting your eyes. The ground beneath your feet feels strange, unstable, after years of the ship's constant sway. You look at your hands gnarled, calloused, disfigured by perpetual blisters and rope burns. You reach up and touch your face, feeling the hollows of your cheeks, the prominence of your bones. This is the profound, disorienting truth of freedom's fragility. A liberation that is not a simple return to normal, but a bewildering entrance into a world that feels alien. A world where your very being is etched with the indelible, lingering scars, physical, mental, and emotional, of a life lived in chains. It's like being released from a very dark, very small box into a vast, blindingly bright world. But you've forgotten how to stand, and your eyes hurt too much to see. For the vast majority of galley slaves, freedom was not an option. Death was their only release. However, for a minuscule number, a stroke of unimaginable luck or a specific historical circumstance might lead to their manumission. This could happen through various means: a change in government policy, a successful peace treaty that included prisoner exchanges, or even, in rare instances, if a slave managed to save enough money through minuscule allowances or extraordinary service, though this was far more common for land-based slaves. Yet, even for those few, freedom was not a simple return to their old lives. It was freedom's fragility, a delicate and often terrifying transition, marked by profound physical and psychological trauma. The lingering scars were both visible and invisible. Physically, a former galley slave would be a shadow of their former self. Their bodies would be emaciated from chronic malnutrition, the pervasive hunger and thirst from Chapter 4. Their skin sallow, and their muscles severely atrophied from years of cramped confinement, save for the specific muscles used for rowing. Imagine Silas, his powerful legionary physique now reduced to skin and bone, his shoulders permanently hunched from pulling the oar. His back a roadmap of old whip marks the grim legacy of the lash and the whip from Chapter 6. His hands would be disfigured, his joints stiff and painful from the constant strain and lack of proper movement. His feet, rarely used for walking, would be sensitive and awkward on solid ground. Chronic pain would likely be his constant companion, a physical echo of his past torment. A common historical truth is that any former galley slave fortunate enough to gain freedom would carry severe and often permanent physical and psychological scars, including chronic pain, disfigurement, and profound trauma, which made reintegration into normal society extremely challenging. Their bodies and minds were irrevocably altered by years of brutal confinement and forced labor. Historians still widely debate the long-term societal integration outcomes for manumitted galley slaves, as detailed personal accounts are exceedingly rare, making it difficult to assess their quality of life or social acceptance post-slavery. A fascinating yet rarely discussed detail about this profound freedom's fragility and the pervasive nature of the lingering scars is the curious phenomenon of land sickness or shore sickness, experienced by newly freed galley slaves, where the constant rhythmic motion of the ship's deck had so deeply reprogrammed their inner ear and proprioception that even on solid ground, they would experience persistent dizziness, nausea, and a disorienting sensation of still swaying or bobbing. A constant physical reminder that their body was still trapped on the phantom galley, even when their chains were gone. Imagine Silas trying to walk down a bustling street, but every step feels like he's on a rocking boat. The ground seems to shift beneath him, the buildings appear to sway, and a persistent nausea churns in his stomach. This wasn't just a metaphor for discomfort, it was a genuine neurological and physical recalibration. A constant, debilitating disorientation that made the solid world itself feel unstable. a phantom chain that bound his very sense of balance to the ghost of his former prison. It's like getting off a spinning ride and the world just won't stop moving. But for them, it might last for months or even years. The psychological scars were arguably even deeper and more enduring. Years of dehumanization, constant fear, and extreme suffering would leave a profound impact on the mind. Many would suffer from severe post-traumatic stress, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares filled with the sounds and smells of battle's brutality from Chapter 8, and a pervasive sense of anxiety. Trust would be almost impossible to regain, as every human interaction on the galley was based on power, fear, and brutality. Social interactions, once natural, would feel alien and terrifying. Imagine the simple act of being spoken to kindly. For Silas, after years of only hearing shouted commands or the cruel taunts of overseers, a gentle voice might feel disorienting, even suspicious. The outside world, with its nuances of human connection, its casual conversations, and its unspoken social rules, would be overwhelming. He might flinch at sudden movements, instinctively anticipating a blow. Sleep would be restless, haunted by the creaking of timber, the rhythmic drum of the oar, and the screams of dying men. Reintegration into society would be incredibly challenging. A former galley slave would have no money, no property, and often no family remaining. Their skills, limited to rowing and enduring punishment, would be useless in civilian life. Their emaciated appearance and visible scars would mark them instantly as former slaves, leading to social ostracization and difficulty finding work. They might find themselves adrift, stateless, and alone, even in freedom. The memory of the pervasive squalor and filth from Chapter 7 would make any attempt at a normal life almost impossible. Their senses would be perpetually assaulted by comparison to their past. It truly sucked when freedom itself felt like another form of isolation. Even if they found work, the discipline ingrained by the whip might be the only way they knew how to function. They might carry out tasks with a desperate, fearful efficiency, unable to relax or enjoy any measure of autonomy. The concept of choice, after years of every decision being made for them, might be overwhelming or even terrifying. For those rare individuals who managed to return to their original homes or families, the reunion would be bittersweet. They would be fundamentally changed people, scarred inside and out. Their loved ones might not recognize them, either physically or emotionally. The vibrant person who was captured years ago would be gone, replaced by a ghost haunted by the horrors of the oar. The gap between their past and present selves would be immense, making true connection difficult, if not impossible. So, while the idea of freedom is universally cherished, the profound reality of freedom's fragility, leaving indelible, lingering scars on those few who escaped the ancient galley, was a sobering truth. This era reminds us of the profound and often irreversible damage inflicted by systems of extreme dehumanization, proving that for millennia, the cost of forced labor extended far beyond physical exertion, leaving deep, unseen wounds that endured long after the chains were removed. Teaching us to value not just freedom, but the dignity and support necessary for true healing, far from the chilling, unromanticized reality of a galley slave's broken liberty.